What if the greatest prison ever built taught its prisoners to become the smartest civilization in the galaxy? For over a century, Earth sat sealed inside a wall of alien light, and every scientist who studied it believed they were looking at a death sentence. They were wrong. They were looking at a lesson plan. The barrier had appeared without warning 127 years ago, a shimmering, silver-blue dome wrapped around the entire planet, silent and immovable. No missile scratched it. No signal passed through it. It simply hummed, patient and eternal, like something that intended to outlast every human who had ever lived. The Triarch Council, rulers of 1,000 star systems, had made their judgment from a distance. Humanity was too violent, too unpredictable, too dangerous to be allowed among the stars. So they caged the planet the way one cages an animal too wild to tame, and they moved on, certain the matter was closed. For the first 20 years, humanity fought the wall with everything it had: nuclear devices, focused energy weapons. Entire national budgets burned on a single hopeless strike after another. The barrier did not flicker. It did not warm. It simply absorbed every act of violence, like a parent ignoring a child's tantrum. And slowly, the world began to understand something painful. They could not outfight this thing. That was the first turning point. Not a victory, but a surrender of the wrong kind of hope. Governments that had spent decades funding weapons programs quietly redirected their money into something stranger: observation, measurement, mathematics. If they could not break the cage with force, perhaps they could understand it instead. A young physicist named Elias Vance was among the first to propose it publicly at a nearly empty conference in a rebuilt Geneva. "We have been asking the wall to fear us," he said. "It doesn't fear anything. It's a machine. Machines can be read." Most of the room laughed him off the stage. A handful stayed behind to ask questions. Elias would not live to see the wall's secrets unlocked. Neither would his daughter. It would take 3 generations of his family and thousands of scientists working in parallel across every surviving nation before the truth began to surface. But that first shift from soldiers to students was a moment humanity's entire future changed direction. The second turning point came slower, and it hurt more. As decades passed, whole research institutes rose and fell. Funding dried up during famines, and wars fought over the shrinking resources of a caged planet. Entire lifetimes of data were nearly lost when an archive city flooded. Twice, governments tried to abandon the barrier project entirely, calling it fantasy chasing an unsolvable puzzle. Twice, small groups of stubborn scientists kept alive in basements and universities, refusing to let the work die with them. Among those who refused to give up was a woman born 4 generations after Elias, Dr. Helena Vance. She grew up hearing her family's story like scripture. The wall is not a cage, it is a code, and codes can be broken. She was 6 years old when she watched footage of her grandmother's failed experiment, an attempt to bend a corner of the field that instead vaporized half a research vessel. She was told gently that some things could not be solved. She never believed it. By the time Helena was accepted into the Global Barrier Institute at 19, the project had become something between religion and science. Thousands of researchers worldwide, connected through salvage networks, chasing patterns in alien mathematics that no human language had words for yet. They had learned by then that the wall was not one field but layered fields, folded over each other like pages in a book none of them could open. The third turning point of this chapter arrived in the strangest way. Not through a breakthrough, but through a mistake. A junior researcher on Helena's team, running an unauthorized simulation late at night, accidentally fed the field data through an inverted equation, and for exactly 4 seconds, a section of the barrier above the Institute turned transparent. Stars, real stars, blinked into view for the first time in 100 years before the field snapped shut again. The room went silent. Then it erupted. People who had spent their entire careers doubting the project were suddenly weeping, laughing, screaming at once. It wasn't a solution. It wasn't even close. But it was proof, undeniable, recorded, replicated proof, that the wall could be changed by human hands. Helena Vance stood at the back of that room, 26 years old, staring at the readout of those 4 seconds of open sky, and she understood with total clarity what she would spend the rest of her life doing. Not fighting the cage, not accepting it, rewriting it, What none of them yet realized was that beyond that cage, an empire built on fear was about to discover that the very species they had locked away had just found the first thread of the needle that would eventually unravel their entire system of control. What does it take to unlock a door built by beings who never expected anyone to even see the keyhole? For Helena Vance, the answer consumed the next 18 years of her life and cost her almost everything she loved. After the 4-second miracle, the Institute exploded with new funding, new recruits, new hope. But hope did not make the mathematics any easier. The inverted equation that had briefly opened the sky was not a key. It was closer to a crack in a wall 1,000 meters thick. Helena and her growing team of engineers, linguists, and physicists spent years just mapping the shape of what they didn't understand. The first major turning point of this era came with devastating cost. Dr. Amara Osei, Helena's closest mentor and the person who recruited her into the Institute, insisted on running a live field test using a scaled version of the inverted equation, hoping to widen the 4-second gap into something sustainable. The experiment failed catastrophically. The local field didn't open. It collapsed inward, and the resulting energy backlash killed 12 researchers, Amara among them. Helena carried her mentor's final notebook out of the wreckage herself, refusing to let anyone else touch it. That night, standing in a scorched lab, she made a promise to the surviving team. They would never again treat the barrier as something to be forced. They would only ever ask it questions it was willing to answer. That single decision reshaped the entire philosophy of the project. Instead of trying to break the field, they began treating it as a language, an alien logic system built from cause and consequence, structured like a conversation rather than a wall. Helena spent years learning to speak in the barrier's own patterns, testing tiny, harmless adjustments and recording every response with obsessive patience. The second turning point arrived not from Helena's team, but from an unlikely source. Children, a group of teenagers at a rebuilt school in what had once been Nairobi, using outdated institute data as a coding exercise, discovered that the barrier's mathematics resembled a recursive pattern used in ancient human music theory, specific ratios repeating at different scales. It was a connection no career physicist had considered, because no career physicist had been trained to think in melody. Helena flew to meet them personally. She sat on a classroom floor with 16-year-olds and listened as they explained, in their own words, why the pattern felt familiar to them. It was a missing translation layer her team had been circling for a decade. Within 2 years, using the children's insight combined with 3 generations of prior research, Helena's team built something they called the Stitcher. Not a weapon, not a key, but an instrument designed to speak directly into the folded layers of the field and gently rearrange them from within. The third turning point of this chapter came the night they tested it for the first time on a full section of the barrier, rather than a lab sample. Helena, now in her mid-40s, stood in the control room with her hands shaking over the activation panel. If she was wrong, the backlash could kill everyone within 100 kilometers, just as it had killed Amar years before. If she hesitated forever out of fear, the project and her family's 4-generation promise would die with her. She activated it anyway. For nearly a full minute, nothing happened. Then, slowly, silently, a section of the sky above the testing site began to shimmer, not the violent collapse of Amar's failed experiment, but something gentler, like ice thinning under warm light. The field did not shatter. It bent. It folded open like a hand unclenching, and for the first time in over a century, humans stood beneath open, uninterrupted sky, watching real starlight pour down onto Earth's surface without a single alarm, weapon, or act of violence involved. Helena wept before she even realized she was crying. Around her, engineers who had spent their entire adult lives chasing the single moment collapse to their knees, held each other, screamed into a night sky that finally looked back. But there was no time to celebrate for long. Sensors across the globe picked up something none of them expected. A response. Deep in the folded structure of the barrier itself, a signal had been triggered, not by humans, but by the field reporting its own failure to whoever had built it. Somewhere, far beyond the reach of any human telescope, an alarm belonging to the Triarch Council had just quietened after 127 years of silence, and something on the other end of the galaxy was about to wake up and take notice. What happens when the jailer realizes the prisoner has learned to pick every lock in the building? For the Triarch Council, the answer arrived as a single impossible data packet. Proof that Earth's barrier had not merely failed, but had been deliberately, elegantly rewritten from the inside. News of successful tests spread through the Institute, and then the world within hours. Governments that had spent over a century treating the Barrier Project as a hopeless side story suddenly demanded briefings, resources, control. Helena, exhausted and still trembling from the test, found herself standing before an emergency session of the newly reformed Global Council, explaining to nervous leaders that yes, they had opened a hole in the sky, and no, they did not yet know what waited on the other side of it. The first turning point of this chapter came within days, when Helena's team detected something unmistakable. A return signal, arriving to the same folded pathway the Stitcher had opened, carrying alien mathematics far more advanced than anything the barrier itself had used. It wasn't an attack. It was a query, cold, precise, almost curious. Something out there had noticed Earthlight and wanted to know exactly what had changed. Helena made the most consequential decision of her career in that moment. Rather than staying silent, rather than treating the signal as a threat to be hidden from, she authorized a response. Not a plea, not a surrender, but a complete, generous transmission of the very mathematics that had freed them. If somebody out there was listening, she reasoned, let them understand exactly what humanity had done and exactly how they had done it. Her advisors panicked. Sharing the barrier-breaking mathematics with an unknown alien power, they argued, was the single most dangerous decision in human history, worse than the failed weapons test of the first 20 years combined. Helena listened to every objection and overruled them anyway. We spent 100 years being punished for what someone assumed we might do, she told the Emergency Council. I refuse to spend the next 100 proving them right by hiding in fear. The second turning point arrived roughly 6 months later, when long-range instruments, repurposed from decades-old barrier research, picked up something extraordinary. Other signals, faint and scattered across dozens of star systems, using fragments of the very mathematics Earth had broadcast. Trapped civilizations, sealed behind their own version of the barrier for reasons no human yet understood, had intercepted humanity's transmission and begun applying it to their own cages. Within the Triarch Council's capital, a vast, ancient world called Ostronome, wrapped in structures older than human civilization, alarm spread through the ruling chambers. For centuries, the Council had maintained order across 1,000 systems through a simple, brutal principle: isolate anything unpredictable before it could threaten the stability of the whole. The barrier around Earth had been their proudest example, proof that even the most volatile species could be contained indefinitely without a single shot fired after the initial sealing. Now that proof was collapsing in real time. Reports flooded in from outposts near at least 4 other imprisoned worlds, describing barrier fluctuations identical to what had occurred above Earth months earlier. The Council convened in a rare full session, and for the first time in generations, genuine fear moved through chambers that had known only certainty. The third turning point of this chapter belonged to a Council commander named Thalvox, a decorated officer who had personally overseen barrier enforcement for 6 of the Empire's imprisoned worlds, Earth among them. Thalvox had spent his entire career believing the isolations were necessary, even merciful, a way of preventing violent species from harming the wider galaxy before they matured. But reviewing the intercepted human transmission, line by line, equation by equation, he noticed something the Council's analysts had missed entirely. The mathematics weren't a weapon. There was no aggression coded anywhere in the structure, no exploit designed to harm, no trap. It was, in its purest form, an act of teaching, freely given, asking nothing in return. Thalvox sat alone in his quarters at night, reading a species liberation manual written not in the language of conquest, but in the language of a gift, and for the first time in his long service to the Council, he began to question everything he had been trained to believe about the species he had spent his life containing. What do you do when the very thing you feared most turns out to be the one thing capable of saving you? For Commander Thalvox, that question would soon force him to choose between the empire that raised him and the species he had once been ordered to destroy. As months passed, the effects of Earth's transmission spread further than anyone, human or Triarch, could have predicted. One by one, reports arrived of barriers weakening across the Empire's furthest reaches. a moss-covered world called Varinta, imprisoned for defying an early council trade, demand 2 centuries earlier, managed to open its first true gap in the sky, a silicate-based civilization on a tidally locked world. Near the Empire's southern reach followed only weeks later. The Council's response was immediate and severe. The first turning point of this chapter came when the ruling triumvirate declared humanity's transmission an act of galactic sabotage, ordering every outpost to jam, intercept, or destroy any further signals originating from Earth. Ships were dispatched, not to attack, not yet, but to encircle the solar system and cut off further transmissions before they could reach any additional imprisoned worlds. Helena watched the encirclement unfold to what remained of humanity's aging deep space sensors, understanding immediately what it meant. The Council wasn't interested in negotiation. They were buying time to decide how to eliminate the problem permanently. Rather than retreat or panic, Helena made a choice that would define the rest of her life. She ordered the Institute to release everything, not just the original mathematics, but every refinement, every improvement, every lesson learned across 4 generations of research, in one final and censored broadcast before the blockade could close the window shut. It worked. Within hours, dozens more worlds had received the complete data. Within days, actual uprisings began, not violent revolutions, but scientific ones, as imprisoned populations who had spent generations believing escape was impossible suddenly found the tools to try. The Council's isolation model, refined over centuries into what they considered an unbreakable system of control, was unraveling planet by planet, faster than any fleet could possibly contain. The second turning point of this chapter arrived in the Council's inner chambers, where fear finally curdled into something more dangerous. Certainty that mercy had been the Empire's fatal mistake. The eldest of the 3 ruling triarchs, a being named Kesserin who had overseen the original decision to cage Earth 127 years earlier, proposed something none of his colleagues had dared suggest in centuries: full activation of the Unmaker, a weapon capable of tearing localized space apart at a fundamental level. Designed generations ago as an absolute last resort against any threat capable of destabilizing the Empire itself. The Unmaker had never been used. It had been built, tested once on an uninhabited system, and then sealed away as a doctrine of last resort too catastrophic for any single conflict to justify. Kesserin argued that humanity's mathematics represented not a single conflict, but an existential threat to the very foundation the Empire had been built upon. If left unchecked, he warned, every imprisoned world in the galaxy would eventually break free, and the Council's authority would collapse entirely within a generation. The vote was close, but it passed. Preparations began to deploy the Unmaker against the solar system directly, not merely to punish humanity, but to erase the source of the mathematics before they could spread any further. The third turning point of this chapter unfolded in the shadow of that decision, inside the private quarters of Commander Thalvox, who had been assigned, almost as a test of his loyalty, to help oversee the weapon's activation sequence. Thalvox had spent weeks wrestling with what he'd learned from studying humanity's transmission. A species capable of this kind of generous, patient brilliance did not deserve annihilation, and a council willing to erase billions of innocent lives to preserve its own authority did not deserve his obedience. He made his decision alone, in the dark, fully aware it would end his career and likely his life if discovered. Using access codes he'd earned across decades of trusted service, Thalvox began quietly extracting the Unmaker's activation schedule, encrypting it inside a compressed data burst disguised as routine sensor telemetry, and preparing to send humanity's greatest scientist a warning that could save billions of lives, or cost him everything he had ever been. What does it cost a lifelong soldier to betray the only home he has ever known, in order to save a world he was trained to fear? For Commander Thalvox, the price was everything, and he paid it without hesitation the moment the warning was ready to send. The message reached Helena Vance in the middle of the night, buried inside what appeared to be corrupted sensor data from an old monitoring satellite. It took her encryption team nearly 6 hours to realize the corruption was deliberate. A code within a code, written by someone who understood human mathematics well enough to hide a message inside noise the Council's own systems would never think to inspect. The first turning point of this chapter arrived when Helena finally decoded Thalvox's message in full, a weapon capable of unmaking space itself, aimed directly at the solar system, with an activation window measured in weeks rather than months. There would be no fleet battle to fight, no barrier to outthink. If the Unmaker fired, there would be nothing left of Earth to study, teach, or save. Helena, now in her 60s, gathered what remained of the original Institute leadership. The children and grandchildren of scientists who had begun this work over a century earlier, and laid the truth before them plainly. Humanity's own weapons, even at their most advanced, stood no chance against a device built to unmake reality. Diplomacy through distance was impossible. The Council did not trust transmissions, and there was no time to build the kind of relationship needed to negotiate remotely. There was only one option left, and it was a kind of option that came with no guarantee of return. Helena volunteered to go to the Council's homeworld herself. The second turning point of this chapter came during the argument that followed, one of the fiercest of Helena's life. Her own team begged her to reconsider, insisting that sending their most brilliant living mind into the heart of enemy territory was suicide, not diplomacy. Helena's response became one of the most quoted moments of the era that followed. We didn't survive 127 years behind a wall by being careful. We survived by being willing to try the thing that terrified us. This is that thing. She would not be going entirely unprepared. Using everything her family's research had built across 4 generations, Helena's engineers completed a portable, refined version of the Stitcher. No longer just a tool for opening barriers, but something capable, in theory, of disrupting the folded space architecture that weapons like the Unmaker depended upon. It was untested at this scale. It might not work at all, but it was the only leverage humanity had. Thalvox, risking discovery with every transmission, arranged Helena's passage himself. Smuggling coordinates, docking codes, and a rough schedule of Council movements through the same corrupted data method he'd used to send his first warning. He made no promises about what would happen once she arrived. He couldn't. He was gambling his own life on the hope that enough of the Council's officers shared his doubts to give her even a chance to speak before being executed on sight. The third turning point of this chapter arrived the night before Helena's departure, when she recorded a message to be broadcast to all of Earth in case she never returned. Standing in the same Institute control room where she had once wept beneath humanity's first reopened sky, she spoke plainly to a species that had spent 127 years learning patience the hardest possible way. She told them the truth, that she might not come back, that the outcome was far from guaranteed, and that whatever happened next, the work of every scientist across 4 generations had already changed the galaxy forever, regardless of her own fate. Then she boarded a small, barely armed vessel, guided by coordinates from a man she had never met and could not fully trust, and set course for a world designed to end her species, carrying nothing but a refined instrument built from a century of patient hope and the full weight of humanity's one chance to prove they deserve to survive. What does it take to convince an empire built on fear that the thing it fears most might actually be the thing that saves it? Helena Vance was about to find out, alone, unarmed, standing before the very council that had caged her entire species for 127 years. Her arrival at Ostrenholm did not go unnoticed. Council security intercepted her vessel long before it reached orbit, and only Thalvox's carefully arranged clearance codes, along with his own physical presence at the docking bay, risking immediate arrest, kept her from being destroyed on sight. She was brought before the ruling triumvirate not as a guest, but as a prisoner escorted at weapon point through halls older than written human history. The first turning point of this final chapter came the moment Helena stood before Kesserin and his fellow Triarchs, expecting threats and finding something closer to genuine confusion. They had prepared for an invasion, a trick, a hidden weapon smuggled aboard her tiny ship. Instead, they found one aging human woman, unarmed, exhausted from the journey, who looked at the beings who had ordered her planet's destruction and said simply, "I didn't come here to fight you. I came here to ask you a question. What are you actually afraid of?" The chamber fell silent. Kesserin, expecting defiance or desperation, found himself answering honestly before he could stop himself, that the Council feared losing control of a galaxy built on carefully maintained fear, that unpredictable species like humanity threatened centuries of stability, that mercy shown once had already cost them 4 worlds and would cost them everything if left unchecked. Helena listened to every word, then activated the refined Stitcher she carried the entire journey. not as a weapon, but as a demonstration, gently folding a small section of the chamber's ambient field exactly as she had once folded the barrier above Earth, proving in real time that she held no aggression, only understanding. The second turning point arrived during the tense hours that followed, as the council debated Helena's fate behind closed doors, while Thalvox, having openly revealed the betrayal by escorting her, awaited his own execution nearby. It was Thalvox who ultimately tipped the balance, speaking before the assembled council with nothing left to lose. He described what he had witnessed studying humanity's mathematics. Not a threat, but a gift freely given, asking for nothing in return. He argued that an empire secure enough in its own worth would not need to erase an entire species to prove its authority, and that the true danger of the council was not humanity's freedom, but the council's own fear of ever letting anything go. Kesserin, faced with a choice between total annihilation and an uncertain future built on trust, made a third and final turning point of the story. He ordered the Unmaker's activation halted permanently, and authorized Helena and Thalvox to work together to dismantle its firing sequence beyond any possibility of future use. It was not forgiveness. It was not friendship. It was, for the first time in centuries, a ruling council choosing understanding over control, simply because someone had been brave enough to offer a real alternative. With the Unmaker disabled, the council's grip on its empire could not hold. Word spread quickly across every system that the ancient superweapon had been dismantled by the very species it was built to destroy, and one by one, the remaining barriers around imprisoned worlds began to fall, not through further human transmissions, but through the Council's own quiet, reluctant decision to abandon a system of fear that had finally proven unsustainable. Helena of Vance never returned to Earth. The mission had always been one way, and the years of travel and confrontation had cost her the health she no longer had time to recover. She died on Ostrenholm 2 years later, surrounded by an unlikely circle of former enemies who had become something closer to students. The same role reverse of her own species had lived through a lifetime earlier. Her final recorded message needed only 6 words to become legend across 100 worlds. Don't build cages, build bridges. In the decade that followed, humanity did not rise to rule the stars through conquest, as the Council had once feared. They became teachers instead, sharing mathematics, medicine, and patience with civilizations still learning to trust a galaxy no longer built on fear. And in classrooms across 100 newly freed worlds, children learned the same lesson Helena's family had passed down for 4 generations, that the strongest force in the universe was never power. It was the courage to trust one another.